start off with that door that started off yesterday with Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm going to present the Imperial Hotel as one of the examples that was discussed in the discussion after. And then we're going to have Amin talk a little bit about the history, a conceptual history of organic structure. Yeah. I think Witten's going to go next, and he has a couple of questions that are maybe a little more theoretical, looking at how the literal and conceptual exploration of topology and texture and influence the restructuring of the built environment through history. And then Kevin's going to bring us back to this integrated place where engineering and architecture and structure and form all come together. So the Imperial Hotel. I'm a landscape architect, and so when I listen to architecture, the first thing that comes to mind is always about these connections, and maybe a little bit deeper the connections than might come out in construction of a building. So having to eliminate the idea of biological or organic. If you go to a grocery store, it's biological. Always relating to a living organism. So it did touch on that a little bit yesterday, talking about the lobster and the shell, and then also using the example of the bird nest, that it does become very organic, but it's still a little bit further away from maybe what I've studied in my past. And then the next word that sort of comes to my mind is natural, and looking at natural materials or natural forms. And obviously this isn't exactly what we were talking about last night. It was very much an organic way of thinking or building, and maybe being derived of a living matter, which isn't necessarily a strict rule in anything that we looked at yesterday. So from that idea, and I think Jacques did a really good job of really showing the integration, the two hands crossing over. And in my mind, the picture that came together was the game of pickup sticks, where it is organic in a way that you drop it on the ground and there's no way of measuring or knowing or even reproducing that same form over and over again. But there is still a rigid structure to it, because the sticks then hold one another up. And the idea of this game, if you're not familiar with it, is to remove one stick at a time without disturbing the rest of the pile. So to me, that's what organic or this idea of integrated would be, that one thing is connected to another. And I mean, the example that was used yesterday was the Guggenheim Museum, and it continues around and around with the shell on the outside, which became very visual and helpful. And again, being a landscape architect, I think that the setting is really important, and Jar touched on that, saying that it is, and it's linked to one another, but at a different level. So what I wanted to walk through quickly is the Imperial Hotel, which was another project built by Frank Lloyd Wright. And basically this brochure from the 1930s shows the hotel in the foreground, but in the background, one of Japan's 3 sacred mountains, which is now a cultural heritage site. And for Wright, in his autobiography, he draws on the importance of the mountain in creating a mood for the city, a mood for the culture that's there. And at the same time, he reminds us of the tectonic forces that created the mountain, the eruptions, the crashes, that also still to this day create the earthquakes and then the subsequent fires that come, which are able to change the structure of a city in a matter of seconds. Entire villages disappear, new islands can emerge, shorelines are completely redefined, and the mountains and valleys have to renegotiate their position. So all of this is followed out by the outbreak of fire, and in Japanese culture it meant treading very lightly on the ground and building very lightly, using natural materials, the wood, the paper, but they were also very susceptible to fire. So Wright approached this project saying, why fight the earthquake? Why not sympathize with it, and why not outwit it? So to build a permanent structure, he knew he had to avoid a very rigid structure. It had to be able to move with the earth. And so he looked very closely at the substrate and the soils that were there and found out that it was about 8 feet of organic material, and below that, a puddle of mud, basically, that went down 60 to 70 feet. And he calculated and he figured that he could pretty much float the building on this puddle of mud that's underneath, so that when the earthquake comes, the building could move and act and react with it. So he made a bunch of boreholes, did a bunch of tests, figured out the structure that he needed, and was able to spread the load out across the site. And he likened the floor structure to this building to the tray of a waiter, so that everything was sort of in the middle and spread out from there. And he contemplated everything, including roofing materials. He lightened what was on top and kept everything on the bottom, so that the center of gravity was lower, so that when the shakes came, that everything was lower and that nothing was toppling off, causing problems. Right down to the reflective pool that was right out front, that would become an important element in case of earthquake, and then this fire that breaks out afterwards, to be able to use the water to either dampen the wood to prevent a fire or put it out afterwards if needed. But there was a problem that he encountered right away, and that was finding an engineer to help him build it, or to find a craftsman to help him build it in the way that he imagined it to happen. Eventually, he gets over the language barriers and over the cultural differences, and the building is built. There's a longer story to all of this, but just to say that it was completed in 1923, and later that year there was a major earthquake. So the building survived. He was quite pleased. It took 10 days to find out, and in his diary and notes, you can almost see him biting his nails at the edge of the table, saying, "Please, not my building." But it survived. And later, in a set of lectures that he gave in England, he responds to a question by a student who's asking about the complexity of current structures and the relationship to the designer. And so Wright responds, "It's true that buildings have become extremely complex, but they have become complex because the system creates its own complexities and confusions. There is no great difficulty in creating an organism, an entity, and the way of building in which it needs services. All needed services are incorporated features in the building. But that type of building, call it a creation, cannot be under specialistic systems such as to which you refer. Such creations must occur by a single-minded mastery on the part of the creator of the building, and that alone is organic building. We cannot, in organic building, have groups of specialists. We have to relegate the expert to the backyard of the building or to oblivion." So I think today what we're going to move beyond in that statement through Kevin is looking at the idea of integration of the design team. So the architect and the structural engineer working together, and new design methods that are brought up, and that's one thing we want to respond to. So as I said, this hotel survived 2 major earthquakes, and it survived a number of bombings through World War II, but slipped into decay through the 1950s and 1960s. And part of the problem was the building was sinking. So automatically, what I imagine in my head is this giant puddle of mud that's underneath has now been sucked dry, and that in itself is no longer helping the building float. So when we're looking at organic, it's a process that continues beyond, and there is the condition of building at that exact moment in time, and the built environment that comes with that. But I think there's also another area of conversation, and it's what Witten is going to touch on a little bit, the conceptual exploration and the influences and or the restructure of the built environment, and how geometric conceptual structures create organic meaning. So the meaning and the relationship between built, I guess, and unbuilt, and how they build together. And what ended up happening to this hotel is it was reduced to a very simple form, and I'm almost not joking by showing this picture, that just the central part of it was dismantled and taken to another site and is now a museum. So when we look at organic architecture, it's a way of building, a way of thinking, and Amin's now going to walk us through maybe some of the things that got us to Frank Lloyd Wright and then even beyond.
Good morning, everyone. So, as a way for me to better understand the material we were presented with yesterday, and as a way of going off the script to hopefully bring new insights to the discussion, I decided to produce this speculative history of what Jacques might call an organic, texturic, and structured architecture. The specific aim here is driven by certain criteria: buildings that go beyond post and beam, whole integrated entities, and buildings or structures that are organic in their unities and perhaps their reference to nature. I will be presenting only milestones with many gaps obviously to be filled. Like all histories, I started from the present. From the examples that we discussed and the readings and lecture yesterday, I thought that Toyo Ito's Taichung Metropolitan Opera House embodied all the criteria we use to define the notion of an organic texturic architecture. If we can somehow trace the historical moment to which this project relates, we can begin to understand its architectural premise. The basic hypothesis here is that this kind of building certainly has roots in both structural and formal the history of architecture, and that we can perhaps begin to interpret the meanings and purpose of such structures by considering these histories. I start with the post and beam, defining the idea of organic structure by its presumed ancient opposite. And here we see just randomly Stonehenge from roughly 3000 BCE. The apotheosis of the post and beam technique found itself in classical architecture, as can be seen in the Parthenon. And fast forward in 3000 years and 3 slides, the technique was carried through all the way to modernism and remains probably the most used and conventional structural system today. But as I embark to explore alternative threads, I want to emphasize that we do not necessarily go beyond the post and beam, but we actually make it more complex and nuanced. It could be argued that there was another early trajectory, less about post and beam and perhaps equally well articulated, relying on vaults and domes that transfer loads along a curved mass and obliterates the distinctions between vertical and horizontal surfaces. And this found its ultimate expression in Roman structures, as can be seen in the baths of Caracalla. This trajectory also found strong resonance in Gothic architecture, where the elaborate structural system is often thought of as providing continuities between walls and ceilings, as can be seen in the Amiens Cathedral. Gothic architecture was famously celebrated by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who chose to work with new materials and technologies of construction, creating unities around the desired space. Stepping back a little, in the 18th century, there emerged another sensibility and perhaps a heightened complexity in thinking about architecture. This is where I would like to actually start the genealogy of what we might call organic structures today. From this point onward, the two previous trajectories just mentioned are somehow blurred to suggest new structures with organic or natural affinities. This genealogy may have found its beginnings in Marc-Antoine Logier's primitive hut, a theoretical reevaluation of the history of classical architecture based on an intimate relationship that it had with nature. We can also talk about Gottfried Semper's encounter with the Haitian hut a century later, which to him became emblematic of the primitive dwelling and thus the origins of architecture, a notion that very much relied on employing basic natural material and the idea of the weave to define architectural enclosure. And back to Viollet-le-Duc, whose work, in addition to being closely invested into Gothic structural sensibility, also began to flirt with natural analogies. We have to keep in mind, going forward from this point, that a lot of these architectural experiments happened with an important backdrop: the development of engineering and the rising competition between the architect and the engineer when it comes to sort of elaborate and new structures. This is particularly significant because the role of the engineer becomes even more important and perhaps gradually more integrated with time. The kind of natural structural integration that Viollet-le-Duc advocated found its expression in several Art Nouveau projects, notably those by Victor Horta, where structure merged with ornamental iron work into wallpaper, into floor patterns, creating spatial and graphic unities. Antonio Gaudi's work is perhaps one of the most significant milestones in this narrative, in that both his structures worked with natural forces, but also his finished architecture mimicked nature through its materiality and textures. Some of the expressionist work, most notably the Centennial Hall by Marx Berg, or those by Hans Polzek, which clearly mimic sort of natural formations, also worked with these sort of natural, organic, perhaps, analogies, and clearly avoided the conventional constructional systems associated with post and beam. Another, perhaps different expression of this unity of structure and space can be found, as Colin Rowe once pointed out, in Frank Lloyd Wright's St. Mark's Tower, and later in the Johnson administration building shown here. The building becomes a single complete entity with obvious resonances to natural organisms, such as a tree in this instance. We're already like in the 1930s, and the role of the engineer becomes central in the early decades of the 20th century, producing works that at that point were very difficult to include in a conventional modernist trajectory. An example being the sports hall here by Eduardo Torroya in Madrid. And it develops in the work of Pierre-Luigi Nervi, with techniques combining waffle slabs with parabolic vaults, as can be seen in this aircraft hangar. Towards the middle of the 20th century, parabolic structures were perfected by the Spanish-Mexican engineer Felix Candela. And perhaps we can add to this another important parallel development, which was the use of pneumatic or inflatable structures as buildings, which rely on completely different structural logic that has to do with surface tension, and which by default would create amorphous and integrated entities. And this structure was one of the first, and it was produced in 1948. Then there were these moments in architectural history that produced organic structures without much regard to structure itself. An example is The Endless House by Kiesler. He writes, quote, "The endless house is called endless because all ends meet, and meet continuously. It is endless like the human body. There is no beginning and no end to it." And this was 1950s. The idea of the extensive, perhaps inhabitable space frame also became current around mid-century, as can be seen in the proposal of Konrad Waxman. This is particularly important because it begins to work closely with the idea of texturic structures. The inhabitable space frame was soon experimented with the aim of creating multi-dimensional spatial environments very much reliant on structure, as can be seen in the city tower proposed by Louis Kahn. And while I tried to focus mainly on architecture, it is difficult to ignore the influence of artists, particularly by those who worked within the so-called modular constructivism, active in the 1950s and 60s, most notably Erwin Hauer and Norman Culper. Frank Lloyd Wright once again contributes to this narrative with another singular, integrated, and continuous structure with emphasis on circulation and flow, as in the Guggenheim Museum in New York. But new buildings at this point begin to emerge at the beginning of the 1960s, which very much resulted from a collaboration between the architect and the engineer. They're complex, integrated, and sculptural entities. A classic example is the TWA terminal by Eero Saarinen. The vast and complex structures of the Osaka 1970 Expo can also be considered a veritable influence on more recent buildings, particularly by those Japanese architects we are investigating here. It recalled several episodes of recent architecture, from metabolism to archigram, and experimented with various types of structures, such as space frames and inflatables. A key moment in recent history is OMA's Jussou Library proposal for Paris, with the idea of pliable, connected, and warped floor plates hovering between a singular continuous promenade, continuous promenade and stacked floors. And I think Cécile Beaumont was actually a collaborator on this project. So you begin to also look in the 1990s at this sort of very close sort of collaboration between architect and engineer. Another significant development was the fold turn in architecture, very much influenced by Deleuze, with which various architects experimented in the 1990s, most notably here again in OMA's work in the Educatarium in Utrecht. We should also not underestimate the influence of the Bilbao Guggenheim in bringing about a strong turn toward the sculptural, the exuberant, and the expressionistic. Not to mention the new digital tools that both enabled the construction of this kind of structure and were developed afterwards. And one key moment, again, as we get closer to Toyo Ito's building that we started with, is the Yokohama port terminal by FOA in 1995, in which the continuous, interstitial, and flowing spaces are certainly an important development in this narrative, but with an added complexity of programmatic connectedness and interdependence. So finally, and as a way of wrapping up this brief history, we go back to Toyo Ito's Taichen's building and conclude with the following. 1, we should not be under the illusion that this is a purely calculated engineering structure, because it is far from it. 2, it does find both formal and structural, its formal and structural logic in previous buildings, perhaps taken to a higher level of complexity and synthesis. 3, the notion of organic structure remains one of artifice and analogy, and it does not necessarily imply an integrated and efficient organism. It only looks like one and perhaps aspires to be like one. 4, the architect and the engineer certainly work much closer than ever before. And finally, 5, the new complexities are certainly not about structure alone, but about program, circulation, and other aspects of the building that aim toward creating more interdependent and integrated wholes. So perhaps the question or provocation that I'm raising here has to do with methodology above all. If Jacques relied on theoretical writings by certain architects or philosophers or theoreticians to explain or understand these recent novel buildings, can we use a speculative form of historical inquiry to unpack and comprehend these same structures? I guess what I'm advocating here is an instrumental deployment of history while we attempt to grapple with unprecedented forms and evaluate their purpose and contribution to contemporary architecture. Thank you.
I think before adding more information to that pile, we'll see if anyone, Jeff, do you have anything that you'd like to comment on so far, or anyone else that's
who's starting?
Thanks. So, thanks, Amin, for that sort of blast through history. I like how it went from the present to the past and then back to the present, kind of fast forward. And so, one of the things I was thinking as you were presenting was maybe to start to tease out some laws or some rules from this. Going from the post and beam, which you could say is maybe defined by its orthogonality, its 90-degreenness. Then to get more organic, you're still linear, but not 90 degrees. So in space frames, I like the pickup sticks example, although I think it's maybe not organic, but more chance. So, and it kind of makes me think of tensegrity structures, space frame structures, like these kind of less, we get linear, but not orthogonal. And then moving beyond that to curvilinear things, so TWHML, for example. And maybe there's a kind of spectrum or gradient. And of course, as you say, these are all analogical things. They're not structural, or maybe the Yokohama port terminal, they start to be programmatic. And so one question I had, this is just like sort of thinking out loud, maybe, is what is it defined in opposition to organic? So what would the non-organic be? Would it be the Anthropocene, the human-made, the things that you wouldn't find in nature? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's important to also define it by what it's excluding, rather than including.
So it sounds like a question to Jacques, actually, because Jacques set the parameters for how we define organic in this exercise, and I was reacting in this really very speculative history to your definition of organic. So maybe you can address this question.
I find your discourse very, very well. And
Well, I don't.
you don't?
No. First of all, let's start talking about what is post and beam. Because it's not Villa Savoie. Come on. And we cannot rely on Stonehenge and the Greek temple for post and beams. So we have to, let's start, before starting to understand organic, to see the other one, what is the post and beam. That's one thing. And I have some others. I mean, if you do a speculative, you have to trace also, I mean, this is not a critique, but I mean, it's a reaction. You can draw, I mean, as many examples as you may imagine. I mean, the first one that comes to my mind, I mean, the great collaboration between Overarp and the architect of the Sydney Opera House. I mean, this is outstanding in your speculative, promenade. So, I mean, either we are clear among us where are the frames. First of all, post and beams, I mean, I still have a question of how do we define that. It's too easy to say that's the horizontal and the vertical, in my opinion. And then, I mean, we can go through, I mean, I think that among us, we can add several other examples to this speculative. So, I mean, my question is, if we don't put the frame, we can do this exercise, but where do we get? Do we get to a definition of organic? That's what I don't get, I mean, completely. But I think that Jacques has to start. Sorry.
I want to return to the introduction, because I think it's interesting, because there is a biological attitude, a natural attitude, and you you take these pictures with carrot, and I think it's not the subject. We are clear with this now. But it's a little the subject, because when Frank Lloyd Wright spoke about organism, he's always in the thinking of an architecture which is determined by the growth. The architecture has to grow from himself, from itself. No? And the growth is the same with Cannes. When you take the tower, it's the same. And it's not really Cannian, not because he does this tower one time for one time, and after that it was not his problem. No? So when there is this problem of growth, I think we speak really about organicism and organic. With Wright, with Kant says this, no? Exactly. He explained it. So with the growth. After that, when you show the pickup sticks, it's not organic. No, it's only stacking. It's like the building by Erdogan de Meuron, Vitra. You don't know?
The
Vitra.
Yeah.
It's only stacking, no, nothing more. No, it's not organic, in my sense. No, in the sense. So after that, you make something very interesting, because but I think we have to be clear. You speak about system. So in the history of architecture, notably in the 19th century, there is really a thinking about systems. And Viollet-le-Duc, but not only Viollet-le-Duc, but also I think the best is Choisy, spoke about systems. There is a Greek system with the construction, the Roman system, the Gothic system, and the architecture is seen with this problem of construction, with what is exactly the relation between construction and architecture, construction and form. When I speak about architecture, it's form. So this relation. So the question after that, you make this history. You speak about Viollet-le-Duc, and after that about Gaudi, and after that about also Torroja, Nervi, all these architects or engineers. But I think when you saw this relation between Viollet-le-Duc, Horta, Gaudi, Torroja, Nervi, you are in the same system. If you read Le Corbusier, Almanach d'architecture moderne, he spoke exactly about this, the systems of architecture, and he takes pictures in Choisy. All the pictures are from Choisy, and there is the Roman system, the Greek system, Roman system, and after he is speaking about the question for him is what is the modern system, what is the contemporary system. So it's a domino structure. it's very simple what I am saying, but it's a domino system. And the question for me is, you are to answer, is today, is it a new system? And I think so.
So a new system exists, I mean, that's your question. We go from the Corbusian system, Choisy-based Corbusian, to the question is there a new system?
Yes. Is there a new system? Now, not know, 10 years ago, it's not a problem of time exactly, but
yes.
Is there a new system? And a new system which is not based upon post and beam. Because the system of post and beam is a system of modern architecture. Of modern architecture, if we saw the modern architecture, like the development of, I speak like this because it's too simple, but the development of the reinforced concrete. No? After that, you can, it's possible to make walls, to make, but a vault by Nervi, it's like a Gothic wall. It's not really different. No? It's not really different. But a vault by Candela is different, I think.
And why?
Because it's a shell. It's a continuous.
Sure.
Yes. So it's you have not in a Candela structure. You have not a primary structure and a secondary structure. With Nervi, you have always a nervure.
Yes.
Always. And you can see after that Gaudi is perhaps more modern than Nervi. I speak like this, huh? Because some of the walls of Gaudi are continuous. No? So Gaudi is very interesting for that. No? But it continues Viollet-le-Duc, and at one time it changes. I think it's another thing, and you have. I think you have to see exactly what happens in a structure, and is it continuous? Is it not continuous? Is it a primary structure or secondary structure? It's important because if you have a primary structure, you can fold all the secondary, and it's quite. It's always a building. No? When Perret said that architecture is the beautiful ruins, no? Make the beautiful ruins, it's that, no? It's the same. The ruin is a primary structure, it's not a secondary. And all the thinking about with Choisy, the thinking is here. No? It's a differentiation between primary and secondary. So you have always, at this moment, you have always two levels. You have always one level which is subordinated to the other. And with a continuous structure, it's not really like this.
Christy, can I ask a question I think is directly related? So I guess for me the gap a little bit is the space frame. So I when I'm thinking about, I don't know, Fuller, or there are probably lots of other examples from, let's say, the 50s, 60s of space frames. And I'm not talking about space frames that sit on top of columns, but more, space frames that hit the ground and become something else. I mean, are those, would you characterize those as the beginning of the current system? are they related? Is that where it begins? I guess I'm a little bit unsure if we're living in a new, systematic paradigm. It had to have started somewhere, and I'm not quite sure where that might be.
Can I?
And this is
maybe
something that he
yeah.
can answer.
So.
Because now we are introducing this idea of the old system that gives, a structure. Not the old, the one system.
I don't want about old system and new system.
No. Because we have all these concepts, they are floating around. I think that he is brilliant in his genealogy, the speculative approach. But if we don't, that's my question, and also Christine, where do we have to frame, where do I, not that I need one date or one example, but I need to understand where the shift is happening and how do I move from one system to another where organic will have a different meaning. Maybe let's go first, Amin.
Okay, so
Yeah, okay.
I speak, yesterday I speak about vertebrate and
Yes.
crustacean.
Yeah.
I think it's important because
I agree. It's a good
because
analogy.
when you are a building with a frame, it's not the same than a building without frame, and it's two-way, And I think in the architecture, a building without frame, it's more contemporary. It's possible now with a new way of calculation, of new way of thinking, etc.
This is very.
So it's I don't know it's new because I'm not interested in the new. But you have to think that in architecture you are not to do every time the same thing, no? So there are architects who are thinking about in a way and other in another way, and I think it's important.
So I think, Jacques, you opened the Pandora box by talking about new versus old system. I would beg to differ and say that nothing is really entirely new about Toyo Ito's building that I started with, but I would claim that it's a new synthesis. And when we go back and look at the sort of the genealogy that I presented, it's not to say that it's a very linear history, that the final result is kind of putting together all of space frames, candela structures, etc. But all of these, think of them rather than like a line, think of them as a constellation that we can always go back and refer to. So I can say, for example, the space frame featured in the repetitive use in all dimensions, actually, in 3 dimensions in Toyo Ito's of these sort of curvilinear forms. The curves might come from Nervi or Candela, and so on and so forth. Not to mention the artists. I think, by the way, they're hugely influential. These artists who work with like complex geometries. And I would also that's at least my conclusion, is that it's really not a story about structure alone. Form and sort of formal sort of intentions may have more to do with what we see today. There is a closer collaboration between architect and engineer, but these are not the kind of super efficient and beautiful kind of structures of the 50s. Like including CCTV, which you referred to yesterday. I mean, it's really, really far from efficient. I mean, if we want to talk about engineering in that sense. But the collaboration is much closer, which is enabling architects to produce these incredible structures.
It's difficult to answer. No? It's very difficult because you can have 2 attitudes, I think. One, you say that architecture is a problem of form, and architects invent forms. with the function, with the context, and the construction goes after.
I'm
No,
actually
no,
saying
no,
it's about both. So,
I know,
yeah.
but it's an attitude possible. But we are now in a problem which is the relation between the form and architecture, form and construction, form and engineering, this relation. And when I speak about system, for me it's the same attitude than as Viollet-le-Duc. He spoke about systems and he tried to understand what is the Roman system or the contemporary system or Gothic system for it, but also contemporary system with the steel, with the use of the steel, all these questions. Today, what can we think about the development of numerical calculations? Because with the numerical calculation, it's possible to take a form, any form, and it's possible to scan this form, and with the scan you can go on and you make the definitive form without parameters. So, and the calculation is mix all the parameters. When you see a page of calculation, you will see all these. You can see in the equations. You can see all the numbers, and it's you have not at this moment a hierarchy between primary, secondary. It's only one form. It's only one, not element, only one form, and only one system. I think when you see the work of Sasaki, it's very, very interesting. It's like this. And he spoke about flux structure because he is in this way. With him, never primary, secondary, always one. Always one. And when you, after that, it's possible for you to imagine a frame structure which is continuous. I don't know if you remember the swimming pool in Beijing. The swimming pool, the Olympic swimming pool.
The bubbles.
A shelter, a great shelter, with a three-dimensional structure with little elements, but always without primary structure. Only like a thick structure, a smooth structure also. And you cannot imagine, you cannot think about this structure like a typical structure of with frame and remplissage, no? With frame and closer. No, it's not the same. So, for me, I think there is something new with email. Something new, but I think also that these forms are possible now with the calculation, with the computer. Without it, it's impossible. Without it, it's impossible. It's impossible to imagine the construction of the stadium of Beijing by Herzog and Demont. It's impossible Really. Because you cannot design the building after produce the building. Now you have you are in the situation, you design, and there is a continuous processes from the design to the production. And it's also, I think it's also this which is important, to make these continuous processes. When Violette Luc, also an engineer in the 19th century, is designing a bridge, he designed a bridge, and after that, there is no continuity between the design and the production. There is you have a step, another step, another step. Now it's not step by step; it's a continuous designing and producing. And I think it's a change in the contemporary architecture. And I think also that the architects are in this way of thinking. They are not obliged, but they are a little in the way of thinking. But they know that when they are designing, also they are producing. Not only designing after that.
I think we should give the other two also the possibility. We have another hour maximum. So, not that I want to stop. I think that I agree with Amin that you open the Pandora.
But it's complicated, no?
No, but that's why we are here. Okay, who is next?
We're going to have Witten and then...
Rush, okay.
Hi, everyone. So my presentation is kind of a historiographical critique, which is aiming at redefining architectural structure, texture, and organicism through the theoretical or philosophical concept of topology, which I guess Jacques suggested or referred to in his abstract of yesterday's lecture as articulating the structure of a building from the design through the use phase. So I guess that there are three driving questions that I'm thinking everyone can consider. The first of which is, how can a literal and conceptual exploration of topology, of texture, and of organicity might actually be a made-up word, I don't know, influence a restructuring of built environmental history? Secondly, how do geometric or topological conceptual structures create architectural meaning? And what can their immaterial textures relay about material textures, if anything? And the third isn't listed here, it's actually at the end of the slideshow, but I'm interested in what is sense and what is nonsense in this presentation, and how we can potentially learn from nonsensical redefinitions of architectural structure, texture, and organicism in order to kind of create historiographical interventions. So I guess that I wanted to start out with my definitions of topology and texture. Topology is characterized by a continuous, organic, and linear, or structural deformation that retains systematic connections between points, while their shapes are sometimes or always deforming, stretching, bending, and folding, rather than retaining a singular forward and backward and or straight and linear pathway, suggesting that points in architectural history may overlay one another at the same time as they're connected. And texture is, I guess, a topological or structural thing that's a term denoting local but systematic deviations of a plane through roughness, waviness, form, and so on. So texture is the degree of spatial complexity not found elsewhere. This is a pretty canonical image from Corbusier's Towards an Architecture, in which he folds Greek temples back upon cars to suggest both the continuity and contemporaneity of their architecture's temporality. And he's constructing kind of an interdependence of the post and beam concept of architecture, demonstrated through the temple with its somewhat successor, the car, and in order to demonstrate that you can move between, first backwards and then forwards again, in order to affirm the logic of the post and beam structure. So there's an interdependence of like the post and beam structure and its partial successor. This is an image from Corb's last building, which was a church in France, and it's just of the material concrete, which he so championed. So Corb's materiality encourages this sort of trans-historical, topological mental action because he's championing this 12 million year old but ever-evolving material for its technological and textural qualities, folding its ancient and contemporary iterations back on one another to articulate topological historical formations or concrete structural logic, its material meaning, demonstrating the continuous organic flexibility of material and its cohesive interdependence. And this kind of demonstrates the conceptual and historical mappings and narratives could or even should take on the structuring logic of texture, or how architects are conceiving of texture. This is a picture of philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who implicitly theorized topologies. His philosophical system, which is outlined in the book Ethics, was based upon a network of geometric postulates about affect, similar to the postulates that undergird the structural logic of organic and texture architecture, because they construct a continuous linear or structural totality. And because he describes these networks as dynamic and agentive, rather than slaves to subjects or objects, or traditional relationships between architects, users, and architectures. So topology could also be viewed as giving organic textural power to material and structure, rather than traditional subjects and objects. This is a really blurry logical dependency graph of his entire ethics, which presents a far more complicated and less useful diagram of the book itself, which is far more linear, but it does give an idea of the book's complexity. This is a somewhat better image that is zoom in on this, I guess, conceptual map. It's this like online diagram, and you can zoom in and zoom out and look at how all the postulates relate to one another, essentially. And this is even a closer look. And I guess I'm trying to suggest that the interconnectedness of the entire universe is structural logic, or he is at least, thereby suggesting a way out of architectural's formal and conceptual autonomy, or even its ocular centrism. So Spinoza's goal suggests overlaying, underlaying, bending, blending, merging, and deforming conventional connections like those between architectural forms, or architecture and forms, but also the phases of a building's design and completion, its patrons, its context, and so on, while retaining architecture's organic continuity. So instead, it's encouraging comparisons based upon ideational, abstract, and/or virtual characteristics. So textural and topological deviations can also refer to organic or continuous aggregates of non-formal meanings, which kind of encourages a potential redefinition of textural as sometimes historical, but always deviating in a manner that interrupts the standard meaning maker, which is, again, this relationship between the architectural object and its concrete, often preceding subjects. And I guess Spinoza is viewing these sorts of pre-individual affective intensities as what he would suggest to reorganize something like architectural discourse around, but this isn't necessarily like where we have to go with this sort of ideational restructuring. This is a picture of the copy, or the front cover of the first English language edition of 1,000 Plateaus, which is a pretty problematic riff on Spinoza in its totalizing effective and elusively spatial emphasis, but it does provide an interesting comparison between the structural and material logic of Gothic cathedrals and 18th century bridges, and in doing so, reveals how historical built environmental forms may become topological rather than or also concretizing meaning makers. So the book's architecture itself, in which it juxtaposes chapters of disparate historical epochs, suggests structuring at least the study of historical time topologically by successively folding historical moments backwards and forwards, up and down, on top of one another. And the cover itself suggests that even some sorts of structural deviations, but not completely topple topological organicity. Well, and this is kind of like the same logic as the Jenga toy. Like, you could pull some of the beams out of this and it would still function, I guess. And I guess I see this as a partial explanation for how in this diagram, how and why Cord places this sort of microbiological or biophilic space below aerial views of cars. It seems that they construct continuous deformations of nonetheless ever materially and conceptually connected forms in order to fulfill the desire. Desire being something that could be a formal ordering principle that organically binds an architecture or an architectural history to kind of normalize, standardize, and or streamline continuous organic movement between seemingly discrete forms or historical moments. This is a diagram of a Gothic cathedral's ribbed arch, and it's a quote from 1,000 Plateaus that describes how topological dynamism, its agentive quality, creates a continuously interconnected organic structural whole. And within this singular connected movement, there's also continuous variation, as also suggested by Spinoza, and also is possibly integral or post and beam to considering architecture as more than formally agentive. So the quote reads, the static relation, form matter, tends to fade into the background in favor of a dynamic relation, material forces. It is the cutting of the stone that turns it into material capable of holding and coordinating forces of thrust and of constructing even higher and longer vaults. The vault is no longer a form, but the line of continuous variation of the stones. Right, and that's just from the Masumi translation. There isn't another one yet. This is a conceptual diagram for a Pyrenee bridge across the Danube, which is what they compare the Gothic ribbed vault to. They describe it as a relationship between designer and government, or really the relationship between, or the combatants of Pyrenee versus the government. The patron or the government is arguing over or between the sort of assemblage, which is pictured here, in its like combination of multiple material forms, and the government's preference for continuous structural whole. Obviously, the government won out, which kind of demonstrates that topological continuity can also kind of deftly perpetuate literal power dynamics or textural movements, rather than just kind of bottom-up agentive ones. This is a roller coaster, which is a built environment that looks pretty explicitly or conventionally like what we consider topological. But they also challenge conventional built environmental relationships between space and time by using textural waves to accelerate experience of still organic temporalities. So it literally manipulates the textural in order to posit that temporal deviation cannot interrupt topological continuity, but rather foster its organicity. And this is a slight deviation from the genealogy I was just trying to lay out, but more explicitly relates to organicism. According to thinker, philosopher, anthropologist Bruno Latour, at least in this book, Western modernity is founded on the logic of a topological fissure rather than a potential deviation, but continuity between nature and society, and subject and object, which suggests that history should reconsider static relationships between architect and built form, even user, in favor of dynamic organic wholes that provide structural continuities. So recent systems and network theories, as well as maybe even cybernetics, suggest constructing topological clusters of continuity between sometimes seemingly disparate nodes like society and nature, which also suggests an integration of the architecturally aformal into the architecturally formal and informal as characteristics of either, neither, or both object nor subject, but as architectural ideation. but we begin to make these sorts of conceptual shifts, or should begin to make these sorts of conceptual shifts in increments, and maybe we have to begin formally with examples like those on the screen. Viollet-le-Duc's illustrations of Mont Blanc, and then again Gothic ribbed vaults, which literalizes the dissolution of the nature-society division with formal continuities demonstrated between these two pictured structures or forms. This sort of relationship is maybe more reductive than how both abstract continuity, with its deviations, articulate transhistoric texture, which provides a wealthier depth in comparison to, rather than the consideration of one epoch or temporality and its topological characteristics. And I didn't really get to adding Manuel de Landa to this discussion, but I think his history of nonlinear time or nonlinear form is a really interesting place to look further in terms of like this sort of topological cultural studies that I'm suggesting might be useful to integrate with architectural history and theory. And then this is just again like the question about sense and nonsense, and maybe hopefully more nonsense, and like how that's productive or maybe not productive, I don't know. And now Kevin is going to talk about the informal, among other things.
Hello. Yesterday, Jacques introduced a number of architectural projects that he articulated as being expressions of novel expressions of architectural form through the complex integration of structure, and interpenetration of structure and architecture to such an extent that they might be identified as organic architecture, a point at which architectural composition itself might even be described as an operation or a complex set of calculations. Among the works that Jacques reviewed yesterday were the Bordeaux House, the Bird's Nest by Herzog and de Meuron, the Taichung Opera House by Toyo Ito, and the CCTV developed by OMA. These projects might be, with the exclusion of Bordeaux House, might be described as seeking a fluid expression of forces through structure, eventually realizing an expression that might be called topological, or in Cecil Bauman's definition, a study of continuity, a forensic of connectivity. One of the examples you cited, which was an interesting, I think, example of one aspect of Cecil Bauman's notion of the informal, was his notion of the local. And in the case of the sort of stressed skin, you talked about the structure actually expressing the forces of flow directly on the surface of the structure. The one other element which I sort of wanted to sort of see if we could sort of introduce back into the discussion of form, in which I want to talk through two key projects that Cecil Bauman has worked on, is the question of program as well, as a kind of internal force pushing out and helping to define the form. So you touched on some of the aspects of the informal yesterday, and I just wanted to try to, I've had to sort of quickly try to grasp some of his terms, but he identifies three sort of key aspects of the informal: the local, the hybrid, and juxtaposition. If the modernist space of architecture, in the case of Mies, began with the white page or the blank page, Bauman says he actually begins with a darkened page or a black hole, actually. Ideas, concepts, equations so dense and thick that he has to sort of pull them out one strand at a time. It's yeah, I'll just say that. One thing that I would like to suggest, which is, I think, the kind of the flip side of the organic smooth space, which incidentally I think has been touched on a few times, is precisely the flip side. Alongside the unified is the ensemble. Alongside the fluid is the static. Alongside the simultaneous is the discontinuous. Alongside the biological is the artificial. And I wonder if these cannot find a way back into the discussion of form and almost complicate the notion of the organic or the natural in such a way that it becomes something else. And what I wanted to propose is that it might be, I could phrase this sort of little chapter I'm producing as post beams and continuous surfaces, sort of utilizing Deleuzian grammar of and, rather than the either or the or, as an assemblage, in fact. So to return quickly to the three concepts that Bellman identifies as the informal, as you say, it is his fresh attempt at the subversion of compositional problematics. It looks at modernist design as rigid and hierarchical, which begins with the idea of an end and then seeks to achieve it. In this case, geometry is taken for granted as a system of isolated bounded shapes. What the informal, the response that Bellman makes is to introduce something what he calls a loose and traveling geometry, giving shape and form. And I want to just look at two cases, I think, that might sort of illustrate that Bellman has worked on, which complicate and sort of hybridize the notion of the organic. Of course, the two buildings actually will be the Seattle Public Library and Sugar Ruban's Pompidou Center at Metz. And the Seattle Public Library, from the outside, we once again see the diagram, a similar sort of version of what we saw with CCTV, I guess an earlier version. A similar sort of topological approach where the structure is actually sort of held in a sock, primarily, in kind of compression, keeping it keeping the lateral forces in an earthquake-prone zone under control. One of the reasons, of course, is to open up the space. They wanted the sort of openness of space. But I'll jump past the program for a moment. But when you actually start looking at the structure, the accessory structure, let's say, the hybrid structure, it is actually a collection of different sort of structures, an assemblage of different structures, opportunistically introduced where necessary. And I think the question of whether these are somehow, the question of purity and continuous surface seems to be sort of bracketed in this case. And if we're looking at these two images, we see in the background the huge core in the atrium, which is a really kind of interesting sort of plinth. There's these incidental columns which come in to pick up forces where necessary, where the diagrid cannot simply hold them. These could be called both juxtapositions of structure systems, but localized responses. This is a kind of not so good. Usually this is filled. And then when you look at it as a whole at night, for instance, you see the collage, not the collage, the assemblage of systems, of trusses, of beams, transversal beams, and you realize that this is truly a hybrid structure. And one of Bauman's projects, this is just a quick detour, is to sort of disrupt the grid But he does it in a very conscious way, a compositional way, one might even say. And he talks about melodies and rhythms and music. For instance, at the entrance to the Kunsthal in Rotterdam, where there's an assemblage of different types of columns, different materialities, holding different resistances or different forces, but a collection and meant as a kind of threshold. And then the final project, which is another interesting example of a hybrid, is the Center Pompidou at Metz by Shigeru Ban, also working with Cecil Bonner, looking at this beautiful 3D printed model. One is unaware actually that this is a deeply material sort of project, in a woven project, in fact, in a project which I think integrates different geometries and different forces of program, in a kind of very casual way. If we kind of resist its composition as a tent or a circus condition, perhaps, its structure is very interesting. This suggests something very elegant, but even when one gets closer, the joints are not necessarily fetishized, but they're there, and one even sees the deformation and strains in the wood. So the continuous surface is actually a materialized sort of force. And I'll leave it there. I was also going to introduce the question of program. I think that discussion's been had probably by a lot of people in the room, but I think that is also an interesting, powerful force that is hard, has been introduced by perhaps OMA, and is hard to take off the table. And so when
Very good. Jacques.
I speak about the first.
Whatever, I mean, you can pick up when you were.
Because the problem of the topology, I think it's very, very interesting, and we have to imagine, not to imagine, but to think about the consequences if we speak about topology.
Sorry, could you...
Because yesterday I speak about Merleau-Ponty, and the thinking of Merleau-Ponty is always with topology, but he don't write many books, many texts about this. But it's for him it's another way. There is the Euclidean way, the Euclidean thinking about geometry, but about space, and there is the topological thinking. And I think it's important because when you speak about topology, it's the relation between the things that are important. It's not the thing itself, but what relations establish one thing without thing. And you are in, like Merleau-Ponty said, you are in the world, so you have a relation between all the environment. So I don't know how to call about it, but it's like something very sick. You are in something very sick. And Deleuze speaks about the same thing, not in the same way, but it's the same thing. And when he speaks about smooth space. Smooth space is always thick. It's not thin. It's thick. he makes the comparison between the felt and the tissue.
Fabric.
Look, he makes this difference, and the felt is obliged to be thick. The felt, it's not possible to be very thin, it's thick. And this thickness, it's for me like the relation of the elements in the thickness are not the same like in a structure, a frame structure. It's impossible, it's a conglomerate. And you are in this conglomerate. And so the thickness is continuous. It's not structural. It's continuous, no? It's something, the felt is continuous. I think it's for this reason that the Herzog and de Meuron and all these architects like Beuys, because he used felt. He used this matter, which is not matter, which is mold, which is soup. It's not. It's impossible to make something straight. No? And Robert Morris makes the same thing with the felt. No? You know the works of Robert Morris, not the minimalist one, but just after the felt. And I think that this thickness represent. Yes, I think it's represent this way of topology, because in the topology, in the geometrical topology, all the elements have relation each other, all the elements. So it's like a network, it's like a réseau, it's like something which is not structured by one primary thing and another secondary thing. No, it's all the elements. It's for that I think topology is very, very important, because always with topology there is a continuous way from the pictures by Greg Lynn, no? Because he speaks about topology. It's topology, and you saw these pictures with Tassa Café, from the door towards the Tassa Café, no? Coffee cup. No? It's the same. It's the same thing. It's not two different objects. It's the same object for the topology. It's not different object. So it's a way of thinking that I think it's new. It's new. Yes, it's new because the topology, Viollet-le-Duc, it's possible for him to speak about topology. The topology doesn't exist. So it's at the beginning of the 20th century. We can speaking about topology with Poincaré, no? He has made a magnificent text about why space has 3 dimensions. No, you know this text? No, it's a fantastic text. Pourquoi l'espace a 3 dimensions? And he spoke about topology, this continuous way to think about one object and to can imagine several objects that are the same and that are more different. If I think about this, it's because when you see in the history of architecture, an historian or an architect or a philosopher which try to think about something which is not the Euclidean geometry, always you see always Merleau-Ponty speak about topology, Deleuze speak about topology, and also when you read some text about by Rainer Banham, he spoke about topology when he's in a situation which is not the conventional situation. He tried to it's not precise, it's it's not really really precise, but it's a symptom. It's a symptom to try to think something different. So I don't know if it is the first question, but when you are thinking about this, at the moment you are obliged to make a rewriting of history, and it's normal. For me, perhaps a conventional historian, it's possible he says me, you are not objective, you are not scientific, you are not. I don't know. He can he can say everything like this, but I think all the historians are always in situation to rewrite the story. It's always like this. So you can recently I read another time Deleuze, no, and not all Deleuze. The last chapter, no, because it's very interesting for me. And after that, I was very, I don't know why Deleuze spoke about Whitaker. This old historian. I have the book by Whitaker, no, but it's in my my library. I take this book and yes, I read it recently, and it was very interesting because Whitaker has a thinking absolutely different from if we compare to Viollet-le-Duc. It's not the same. He's speaking about the same thing, the Gothic architecture, and it's not the same. Viollet-le-Duc is absolutely not Deleuzian, you know, because Viollet-le-Duc is the frame, it's the structure, and Whitaker is Deleuzian, because it's not the structure, it's the continuity. You show this drawing. It's a continuity of the walls. It's and with Whitaker, it's what I am saying. It's more complicated, more sophisticated, and it's very interesting. And if you start to read Whitaker, you are obliged after that to read Alois Riegel. And after that, you are in the German world, and yes, it's not the same. It's not the French world. It's not the Italian world. It's another thing. And this question of topology is more. They never speak about topology because they don't know exactly what it is. But it's that. No? And it's a world of thinking the continuity, thinking the thickness, thinking the relation to the world, thinking with Merleau-Ponty, thinking with Deleuze, and at this moment, I like the philosopher. You know, not in themselves, but like they touch something very important for me, and for us, I think also a little.
Well, he made in historiography, so it's important. Felipe, what do you want?
Thank you. I just wanted to notice that it's really important that it touched actually the subject of program in a discussion, which is almost like leaving out that aspect of architecture. And I think the way in which topology could be really important for architecture, not only in terms of how to make sense out of it, but also like a drive of architectural production, is actually topology in terms of organizing the flows of a building. For example, I think that the Yokohama terminal is really a good example of that, in the way in which topology not only produces an effect in terms of space, or in terms of form, but also it is the very way in which flows and the program of the building is organized. The same with some of the Kohlhaas buildings. So I wanted to, I don't know, do you want to elaborate a bit more out of that? Because I think it's one of the things that are kind of aside of the discussion at the moment.
I want to if you want, I chose to for the lectures, I chose to speak about materiality, construction, structure. It's a choice. So your question is very, very relevant, because I think there is also a question about the program, the continuity of program. You speak about Yokohama, but we saw the library of Jussieu. So all this attention to an architecture which is not with a succession of rooms, but which is I think the ideal of the free plan sometimes, no? But when we are in this house, it's absolutely not a continuous space. You have what in France we call the enfilade. No? There is one enfilade, two enfilades. It's like a Beaux-Arts plan, no? And it's not it's absolutely not the problem of continuity. And the fourth lecture, I speak about this, so I don't want to.
Jacques, just to go back to that, I'm sensing in this new topology. Sorry, I'm sensing in this new topology an I would say potentially fetishizing of the fluid and the continuous. And so I wanted to reintroduce the sort of polarity of that which resists the continuous, which is outside of the continuous. And I think, the continuous flow as a form of social organization, for instance, sounds very confusing and very strange. And so the question of something which opposes flow, which rejects flow, seems to me a crucial sort of part. I mean, the question of pure fluid or pure fluid movement, the body without organs, as Deleuze will even remind you, is a fascist machine. Let's just sort of throw that out there. That's in the sort of back of my mind, pure continuous surface. And so in this, what do you think about the kind of resistance then to flow, or the opposition to flow, or that which cannot flow as part of the vocabulary?
Kevin, you're thinking about something specifically in terms of architecture?
Well, I've showed some examples of sort
did.
of hybrid sort of conditions, which both refuse entry. When you take Jussieu, Kohlhaas abandons that project. He puts it in one he takes some of the strategies, but he puts it in one part, and it's in fact an assemblage of different encounters, resistances, dead ends, continuities. And that structure to life seems, for me, more plausible than the notion of continuity, which is finding its expression so well in architecture right now. But I question it as a metaphysics even. And Deleuze questions it as the pure flow, right, as a metaphysics, right? As much as surfaces, there are mesh surfaces which can be activated at any point, which which have virtualities in them, there are limits at times, and I wonder about that. And it seems to me that this topological fixation can't quite come to terms with that right now.
You speak about Seattle.
Seattle.
Seattle, sure.
And I don't. I'm not always the answer, but I think with Colas and the question of program, there is it's always paradoxical. It's always yes, a paradox, because if you remember Delirious New York, in Delirious New York, the most important example is the Downtown Athletic Club, and the Downtown Athletic Club is a succession of level of floors with different programs. So you can say about it, it's not continuous, it's discontinuous, it's the opposite. But it is in one building. So it's yes, it's I think a paradox. But after that, when you look at another building by Colas, you are always in this situation always between continuity and discontinuity, always with the question of program, and he wants always to make a building which has all the functions in it, and which is what he calls the congestion. So there is this situation of it's very heterogeneous, necessarily, and it's heterogeneous, but in a whole, in a building, not in an assemblage, no, in one thing. And he has always this contradiction between the discontinuity of the functions in the building and the continuity of the path. You can go from one function, one element of the program to another with the path. It's like the Dutch embassy in Berlin with all this path, and the metaphor he takes just at the moment of the Dutch embassy is a movie. He takes the pellicule of the movie and he made a drawing with this pellicule, and he explains nothing. So we have to think about is a building a continuous program, or is a building a continuous program, but with sequences, because in a film, in a movie, there are sequences. But it's this always this the relation between the whole and the parts with him, and the question of continuity, as it's always different when you see the library in Seattle, when you see the library in Paris-Jussieu. Always it's an interpretation about, I think, this problem from continuity, discontinuity, and Colas, it's a person very, very complex, because I said it yesterday, I think, at the beginning of his work, in the 80s and at the beginning of the 90s, he was really, his architecture is really collage, assemblage, always assemblage, collage. And this position, this attitude changed at in the middle of the 19th, when he tried to, I think he tried to do, to conceive a building from the starting of a wood, like Casa da Musical in Porto. It's not the same attitude than before, but always it's not the continuity, but all this program in one building, in a wall, not like assemblage. It's not always like this, because in the lectures this evening I speak about also a project by Colas with heterogeneous parts. So it's not always like this, but I think it's.
Yeah, okay, Jesse.
So I have a question that maybe throws a wrench, but unites the two or the four presentations and also a lot of your comments. Because this figure, while maybe less fashionable and not alive today, was trained as an engineer, worked as an architect, is Swiss, and his name is Heinz Isler, and he did a lot of, sort of embodied a lot of both sides of the binaries that we're sort of discussing. He did thin shell structures with total continuity and no kind of columns. He also did pneumatic formwork for roofs on posts, so kind of a both and. He also, way before computers, calculated, as an engineer, the stresses based on models, going to like millions of a millimeter. And so I think he's a very interesting example. And he did tons of buildings all over Switzerland and France. And so I think maybe this sort of problematizes some of these distinctions and either or. And also, like, he's very understudied.
I don't know if it problematizes the questions. I mean, mid-century up to maybe like the 70s. The 80s is always a gap for some reason. I don't know what happened in the 80s. Exactly. But there was always like this sort of engineer envy. You know, while the modernists were trying to like break free of the orthogonal, the engineers were doing these incredible things. What's happening more recently, I think, is really a much closer integration. We see less creative structures by engineers, but we do see them like working with architects and producing these sort of more complex synthetic forms. So I'm sure there will always be like outliers to this sort of simple story, but I think what's happening more recently is again like the sort of closer collaboration, which is interesting. But I would go back and really emphasize that it is more about form than structure purely. Structure is definitely calculated, but I think it's more architecturally driven than before.
Can we try to understand? I mean, I was very much interested in this idea. Sorry. Yesterday you talked about organic, texturic. I mean, we try to analyze these two terms, concept and so on, and then topologies coming in with this historiographic approach. But it seems like, I would say the L'Uovo di Colombo, the Columbus. I mean, it seems that with topology, I can try it. I mean, this is my understanding. almost to find, I mean, in terms of intellectually, a kind of synthesis. I mean, because when you talk about topology, I mean, you talk about this fluidity and so on, and you think about going back to, I mean, structure and form. I mean, in topology, you don't even need, I mean, to have this duality, you know, because topology seems an overarching, I mean, concept. So I'm just, I mean, I was fascinated by this, the way we went today. I mean, from going to the essence of what is post and beams and organic, to find a new another concept. So going back to your idea of system, I mean, one system, another system. Topology is part of this contemporary system? Is a sine qua non at this point? I mean, because organic had been used in the 19th century and so on.
For the numerical the numerical architecture, all the topology is it's a condition.
It's a condition.
Yeah. It's a condition. It's impossible to think about numerical architecture without topology.
Mm-hmm.
When Sasaki speaks about the flux structure, it's about the sensitivity analysis, and the sensitivity analysis is the same word than as Henri Poincaré when he spoke about topology. It's the same. No? It's not it's not comment on dit? Oh, I don't find the word. So there is this. It's a condition, I think. A geometry which is not Euclidean, a geometry which is only based about the relation between the elements and not the distance between the elements. It's without importance. It's a relation. We have to remember that when the Team 10 and Candidis Joseph Woods are making the project for
Berlin University.
not for Berlin, for Frankfurt.
Yeah, okay.
When they are, and when Woods spoke about the web, you know this text, the web. He spoke about topology. He don't have the word with him, but
okay, well.
it's about topology relation. And when you read the text by Bakema, but all these architects of the 50s, 1560s, in the brutalist movement, but not only in the brutalist movement, in the with all these problems of megastructure, with René Banner and all. Always they touch this problem of topology, because they are interested in the relation between the things and not the thing. It's always that they say, no, the importance is not the thing, but the relation between the things. Look, when you are discussing this, I think you are like a field, no? And in this field, you are a relation between all the things. What are you doing at this moment? You are doing a felt. The aggregation and the relation, not a relation between one thing and the distance between this thing and another thing. No, like a mesh. It's like a mesh. And Toyo Ito understand this, because when he spoke about Tarzan in the Media Forest, you know this text, which is very important. He supposed that he speak about not mechanical world, but numerical world. I don't remember exactly, but it opposed the mechanic world, the modern world, with the world of of the car, of the what we saw at this time with Le Corbusier. So he opposed the mechanical world with the numerical world, and the numerical world for us, and everybody here is like this. You have a phone, no? And you can make a relation with somebody, whatever you are. So you make a mesh, and it's not the distance which is important. It's to have the possibility to connect. It's always like this, no? And the distance you don't know. You can phone and you are at 200 kilometers or 3 meters. It's the same. So it's not. It's a world which is really different. I think I spoke about a sick world because all is interconnected, and it's topology. It's topology. It's not geometry, Euclidean geometry. It's topology. And when Deleuze spoke about smooth space and striated space, it's very interesting the difference, because it's a difference, but it's not an opposition, because a smooth space, it's possible for it to become a striated space, and it's always it's not finished, this distinction, and if you take a smooth space like the sea is a smooth space, because it's if you are in the middle of the sea, you don't know where you are. But at the moment there is a relation between an arbor to another arbor, the sea becomes a striated space. It's not the same. So you can have this relation. So, but with the smooth space, with these relations, the striated space, it is possible. It becomes a smooth space, but with thickness. And this one is for me, it's poetic. You know, it's poetic,
to make philosophy poetic.
Yes, it's poetic, because you can, after that, you can look at some problem architecture, and you can, I don't know, you can develop some thinking and some interpretation. I think they can be interesting, and I think when you make a work and make a research, when you make a thesis for you, these moments, they have to exist. They have to exist, because
you breathe.
It's interesting. So I have an observation about everything we've been speaking about these last few days, which is something that probably will touch upon the first two questions we got today from Jesse and Maristella. And it has to do with, I find your exclusions from these sort of discourses as interesting as the inclusions. So we're not talking about Gary here. We're not talking about Zaha Hadid. We're not talking about asymptote. We're not talking about... So organic and texturic and the idea of structure for you, although these guys use incredible structure sort of systems, right? It's not about that. You're kind of committed to a very disciplinary understanding of architectural culture, one that is very much embedded in the modernist tradition. I mean, these notions of structure, of program, and all that are very, very much, modern concepts. I mean, Zevi wrote about all of these in the 60s in the language of modern architecture. I mean, he really spelled them out. He could be writing today about, if you read the book, he could be writing about Ito's project. So I find your trajectory really, really interesting. And that takes us back, for example, to, again, Ito's project. it is true that it may be like a new structural system, a new spatial system, but it's still very much working within the constraints of the box, the modernist box. It may be very curvilinear, but it's also very much stacked. I mean, there is a certain hierarchy of levels. And that's why, again, I would go back to say, maybe what we're talking about is not necessarily newness, but it's a new synthesis. It's kind of an evolution of a particular line that's very much embedded in sort of historical moments of 20th century and beyond. Is that a fair way of talking about your project here?
Well, it depends to you. I think it's a good way to, to phrase it, or to frame it. Think about your, we need to stop, but anyhow, who you are as a practicing architect, as an historian, and how you imply, now you said something very interesting. I read the leurs, and at the end, it made me thinking, but also made me say, oh, there is a lot there, and it's giving me a lot. I feel, you say I feel happy. I could see poiesis there. So how would you describe your way of working? Or you think that the way Amin tried to...
my way of work, it's always difficult to speak about it, but I am at the beginning. I was a critic. It's very difficult to be a critic because the architects don't like the critics.
No, critic doesn't exist.
Really
Go back to that foolery. No criticism, only history.
No, but I speak about critic because I was obliged to interest me to buildings. It's difficult to say something about a building. No? It's not easy. You can speak about the context, you can speak about the function, you can speak about the program, you can speak about the construction. But what is, for me, always the problem is to speak about form. It's complicated, no, to speak about form. So, always my preoccupation had been to understand if an architect, it's not a problem an architect, but it's the building is the result of a thinking of a form. And what is this thinking of a form? So it's for that why I interested me about composition, because composition is how do you conceive a project? What are the elements? What are the how you put all the elements to make a whole? And it's not a question of program. It's not a question of context. What the most interesting theoretician like this is Durand, Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand, because it's really abstract. How to do a project, and it's really abstract, and it's a method for him. It's a method. So if you, I start with this problem of how to do a project, how to make a project, and after that you have my method is to read all the books, to look at projects, to look at buildings, and to imagine, not to imagine, to analyze what is the method of conception, the method, the way of conception of this building, of this project. So you have to, for me, I have to make, to fabric this world of around the question of conception. Around the question of conception. So I start. I don't start because after that I teach from I don't know 30 years. So you start to make a lecture. You start to make
your classes, your students.
for a year. You have lectures about this problem. After that you the problem continue to grow. And at this moment, you have some concepts for this, for that, and you are interesting for what is. At the moment, you are always interested by what is deviant. Deviant. Deviant.
The deviant.
Yes, not in the right way, but in another way, and so it's my method, no? I don't know exactly. It is if it is really a method, but it's like this. You make a world, the world of a problem. I see. So there is not only a world. There are I don't know, one world, two worlds, and interconnection between these worlds. But in this world, you have to find a key of understanding. So a key of understanding is a concept. Oh. And after that, I tried, but you are in a situation to read again. Always I read again a book I have read. It's un conseil. I think a book or a text, or you have to read it one. You have une fois yes. 2, 3, 4, 5. Because always you have not the same reading. Always, but because when you continue to work at a moment, the old text you have read have a new signification, new thinking in it. So it's very important not to have this. I think it's my problem. It's not necessarily your problem, but I think this sickness, no, because when in a work, is it sick or is it sin? No, if you want to have a sick work, no, you have to make also all these relations and to rewrite the history to make really your world, and after that it's very. I see at this moment it's a little poetic, yes, a little.
Well, I think we need to stop also because you have a tour of the vaults. It has been extremely challenging. Thanks, Jacques, also for your generosity. To expose yourself so generous, I would say. Yeah? So, well, we'll meet again for lunch. First of all, we need to be strong. And then the afternoon lecture, Piranesi, Urban Flora, and Nolly, I don't know how Brent Colas is coming in, but as I agree with Amin, I have to say, it's more interesting what is not there, because then it comes back to the surface.
To haunt you.
Okay.